Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Initial Education. My name is Emily. I'm a diabetes educator here at Children's Minnesota, and this is video 2, Understanding Insulin. I'm going to get my PowerPoint shared with you, and then we will jump on in to further our learning. So this is video 2, Understanding Insulin. In our last video, we learned more about the pathophysiology of diabetes, what's really happening inside of our bodies, and why we need insulin. So now let's do a quick review of what we learned about insulin in the hospital. So our insulin pens, they are sensitive to light and temperature. So we do not want to leave our pens on a windowsill, in the car, out in the sunlight, because they will go bad pretty quickly. Our insulin is also sensitive to temperature, and it is best kept refrigerated. Whenever you pick up more insulin from the pharmacy, you do want to bring it straight home and put it in the refrigerator so that it is good until the expiration date printed on the pen or the box. If you're ever leaving the pharmacy and have a couple more errands to run, you can always ask the pharmacist to give you an ice pack so that that insulin stays cool until you get home. It's a nice little insider tip for you. Now, our insulin, once it is brought up to room temperature, or once we open it and we've attached that pen needle for the first time, it is then good for 28 days or 4 weeks, 1 month, however that works best in your brain. So if we're on really tiny doses of insulin, let's say we're on 2 units of Lantus every night, we're probably not going to use up the entire 300 units that are in a pen. And so we want to remember to stop using it after 28 days because it's not going to be good insulin anymore. In that case, whenever we open a new pen, we want to write the expiration date directly on the pen so that when we come to that date 4 weeks later, we know that this insulin is no longer good to use. We need to throw it away and open a new pen. Now, once we've opened our pen and started using it, just keep it at room temperature. Putting it back into the refrigerator will not prolong the 28 days, and it's no fun to inject cold insulin, so just leave it at room temperature. It's also really important that we always keep our insulin with us. That's going to help it stay neutral temperature. But more importantly, we never know what's coming in life and we need to be ready for it. So even if we think we're just running to Target for 5 minutes, running to the neighbor's house to get an extra egg, bring your insulin with you. You might get locked out of the house. You might go to Starbucks on your way home from Target and get that unicorn drink. Whatever happens, we need to be prepared. So bring that insulin with you. Now, with our insulin therapy that we're using, our goal is to mimic what the pancreas actually does in our body. And so this image is the physiologic secretion of insulin in a person who has a functioning pancreas. So there are 2 different graphs here. We've got the top one, which is green. This is actual insulin secretion. And then the bottom graph is red, and this is glucose value, blood glucose value. So let's talk through the glucose value one first. So what you can see is at the bottom of that graph is a solid kind of hot pink magenta line. And this is symbolizing our basal glucose. So basal means base. It's our base background glucose that's being secreted by our liver and our muscles in the background so that we always have energy throughout the day to function. This is what lets us blink, breathe, it keeps our heart beating, all in the background. So we have this basal glucose being released into the bloodstream from our liver and our muscles. Now on top of that, we have our mealtime glucose. So this is glucose that's being released into the bloodstream from the food that we eat, carbohydrates primarily. And so with that, you can see that the blood glucose value really fluctuates based on what we're eating. And so you can see in this person, they ate breakfast around 8:30, that blood sugar level rose and then fell. Then they ate lunch around 12, their blood sugar rose and fell. They ate a little snack and then they had dinner around 5 and their blood sugar rose and fell. Now, this is very normal for somebody with diabetes and without diabetes to see that blood sugar level rise and fall throughout the day. Now, let's look at the top part of this graph, our insulin graph. This is how the pancreas is handling the glucose. So we've got that green bar at the bottom, that's that basal insulin. It's the base background insulin that's being secreted to handle that basal glucose. On top of that, we've got additional bolus insulin, and that's to handle that glucose that's being released into the bloodstream with meals. And so you can see throughout the day here that this person's bolus insulin levels rose and fell in tandem with the glucose values below. So this is our true goal with injection therapy, is to mimic what the pancreas is doing. So we need to take both basal insulin and bolus insulin. All right, so let's learn more about this basal bolus regimen. So to be on a basal bolus regimen means we're taking two different types of insulin. The first is our basal insulin, or our background base insulin. Common brands are Lantus and Basaglar. There are other ones as well, but most likely you've started on either Lantus or Basaglar. Now, our basal insulin, again, it's working in the background. It's our base insulin, and it lasts in the body about 24 hours. So we take this once a day. The purpose of our basal insulin is to allow that glucose from the liver and muscle stores to enter into the cells throughout the day and night. I like to think of my basal insulin as a sort of doorstop. It's just propping up those cell doors a little bit so that glucose can get in continuously in the background. Now, since our basal insulin lasts for about 24 hours in our body, we do want to take it about every 24 hours. So we want to give it at the same time every day. Now, you don't need to be super specific and give it to the minute exactly every single day. Don't have to rush home at 8:02 every night. You can give yourself a 2-hour window. So give yourself an hour before and an hour after your last dose. That's your 2-hour window for the next day. So let's say tonight you took your Lantus at 7 p.m. Tomorrow, try to take it between 6 and 8 p.m. Gives you a little more flexibility in your life. Now, if we ever forget to take our basal insulin, and it will happen, everybody's going to forget a dose at some point in their life. Take that dose when you remember. We need that background insulin to get back into our body as soon as we can. From then on out, we're going to want to retime the dose in 2-hour increments until we get back to our desired time of administration. So what that would look like in real life is, let's say we normally take our Lantus at 7 p.m. The next day at 10 a.m., we realized, shoot, I forgot my Lantus. What do I do? Take it right then at 10 a.m. The next day, give it at noon. The next day, give it at 2 p.m. The next day at 4, then 6, then 7. So you can keep moving that dose in 2-hour increments until you get back to your desired time. This is going to give you the most stable blood sugars. It is a little, tedious, but it's going to keep your blood sugars the most steady by retiming it like that. All right. Our second type of insulin is our bolus insulin. This is our Humalog or our Novolog. Humalog is what you got discharged home with in the hospital, but a lot of insurances prefer Novolog. Totally fine. They work the same. It's just a brand name difference. It's like Coke and Pepsi. Anyway, back to our bolus insulin. Our bolus insulin is used to accommodate our carbs that we're eating and to correct elevated blood sugars. The way that bolus insulin works is it starts working about 10 to 15 minutes after we inject it. It's working its hardest about an hour, hour and a half after injection, and then it should be out of our body in about 3 hours. I want to circle back to the onset. So it starts working about 10 to 15 minutes after injecting it. Now, when we eat, our blood sugar starts rising almost immediately. So whenever we're eating, it is best practice, if possible, to give that mealtime insulin 10 to 15 minutes ahead of time. This allows that insulin to start working at the same time as when your blood sugar is starting to rise 10 to 15 minutes later. This is going to reduce the peak of your blood sugar in between your meals and helps even things out a little bit. And you're going to feel a lot better not having such high peaks between your meals. That being said, pre-bolusing, that's the term that we use for this. Pre-bolusing is one of the hardest diabetes behaviors to adopt because when we're hungry, we're hungry. And depending on the age of your child, there may be not any waiting period allowed. So you just have to do your best. If anything, make sure that you're giving it at the same time as you're eating versus after you eat. But best practice is to give it 10 to 15 minutes beforehand if possible. Quick little note there on the bottom, I did mention this briefly. Insulin brand, so Lantus versus Basaglar, Novolog versus Humalog, it's completely dependent on your insurance and what they prefer, whatever is included on their formulary. So if we ever get notification that your insurance prefers Novolog, but right now you're using Humalog, we'll just order Novolog for you. No big deal. Again, just a brand change, but want to give you that heads up that that may happen. Okay, moving right along. Insulin dosing. So before we really learn more about dosing, I want to talk about terminology. There are 3 specific terms that we use to describe the actions that we're taking in diabetes cares. In talking about terminology helps us have really clear communication when we're talking through my children's, talking over the phone, talking in an appointment. It just makes sure that we are communicating effectively and we know exactly what we're saying to each other. So the terms that we use are cover, correct, and treat, and they have specific meanings. So if we're saying that we are covering our carbs with a meal bolus. Correct is in regards to correction doses, so we correct our elevated blood sugar with a correction bolus. And then we treat our low blood sugars with uncovered carbs. So cover, correct, treat, those are kind of our verbs that we use to describe the actions we're taking in our diabetes cares. This is not something you need to study before bed at night. It's just something to be thoughtful about when you're communicating to us so that if you say, hey, I was super high at noon, when we ask you, well, did you cover your carbs at breakfast? You know exactly what we're asking. So again, something to be mindful about. Okay, let's move into insulin dosing. How do we calculate a bolus? So these are going to be pretty familiar. I'm going to really delve into the correction bolus a little bit further from what you learned in the hospital. But let's start at the top. So for our meal boluses, how we calculate that dose is by using our carb ratio. Our carb ratio is how many grams of carbs 1 unit of insulin covers. So your carb ratio is listed as 1 unit per 15 grams of carbs, could be 1 unit per 12. It really is a personal thing. It's different for everybody. But that's what our carb ratio is, 1 unit per X number of carbs. To calculate our meal bolus, we're going to calculate our total grams of carbs we're eating and divide that by our carb ratio. That gives us our meal bolus dose. So for example, let's say our carb ratio is 1 to 15. We're going to be eating 34 grams. So we'll do 34 divided by 15. That comes out to 2.27. And we're going to round down to our nearest half unit, which is 2 units. So in this case, our meal bolus would be 2. All right, moving on to correction bolus. Our correction bolus, right now, you are using your printed correction scale that you were given in the hospital. And your correction scale would look something like 1 unit per 50 points over 150. Again, this is regarding your blood sugar correction, additional insulin to bring that blood sugar back into range. So when we're looking at corrections, we are looking at our sensitivity. Our sensitivity is how much 1 unit of insulin lowers our blood sugar. So in that example of our correction scale of 1 unit per 50 points over 150, our sensitivity is 50, because that's how much our blood sugar should drop with 1 unit of insulin. Now let's talk about calculating a correction bolus. Again, you can use that printed correction scale you were given in the hospital, but I really do urge you to learn how to calculate a correction bolus so that you don't have to bring that paper with you everywhere and you can calculate your doses on the fly. It's also going to give you a little bit more accurate of dosing if you calculate them. So if we're calculating them, what we do, we take our current blood sugar, subtract our target blood sugar, divide that by our sensitivity. So real life example, we're going to say that correction scale, again, is 1 unit per 50 points over 150. Let's say our blood sugar is 267. We're going to do 267 minus 150. That gives us the total number of points we are above our target. So that's 117. Divide that by our sensitivity, which is 50. 117 divided by 50 is 2.35. We'll round that down to 2 units. So that's how you calculate your correction bolus. Current blood sugar minus target blood sugar divided by sensitivity. Now to loop back a little bit, that target blood sugar, what is it? It's whatever you're correcting above right now. So some of your scales might start when you're over 160 or when you're over 180. That's what you're going to be using as your target for your calculation. Now, little side note on the right side of the screen. If we are administering a meal bolus and a correction bolus at the same time, and we're calculating our correction bolus, we want to add together our meal bolus and correction bolus before rounding, add them together, and then round down to the nearest half unit. Why do we do that? Helps with more accurate dosing. So in these two examples before, if we had added these together after rounding the individual doses, we would have rounded down to 2 and rounded down to 2 for both our meal and our correction bolus. Add those together, it'd be 4 units. Now, if we had added them together before rounding, it would have been 2.27 plus 2.35, which is 4.52, and we would have rounded it to 4.5. So we got a different dose out of that. Now, is one way wrong versus the other? No, but it's best if you added them together before rounding down. You're going to get a more accurate dose. Now, I know that that's a lot, and I'm sorry if I confused you. You can certainly use your printed correction scale. I just want you to be aware of how to use that scale to calculate your dose in case you want to leave that paper at home. Okay, so let's talk now about our 3-hour rule. So if you remember back to when we were talking about how our bolus insulin works, you'll recall that our bolus insulin lasts in our body for 3 hours. So with that, we have what we call our 3-hour rule. And our 3-hour rule tells us that we cannot give a correction dose within 3 hours of our last rapid acting bolus. So we cannot correct a blood sugar within 3 hours of our last dose. We still have active insulin in our body. Now, a little caveat with this is within those 3 hours, we can still cover carbs. So you can still count up your carbs, give a meal bolus. But if we do that, we need to reset that 3-hour clock for when we can check a blood sugar and give a correction bolus again. So in real life, let's look at this timeline image on the bottom. So this horizontal line is showing us time in hours, and then the vertical line is the active insulin in our body. All of these little upside down U's, that is that 3-hour action time of insulin. And if you remember back a couple slides, that physiologic secretion of insulin slide, if you remember, insulin level and blood sugar level rise and fall in tandem. So these upside down U's can also represent blood sugar rising and falling after meals. Okay, let's walk through this person's day. They woke up, it's 8 a.m., they want breakfast. They have no active insulin in their body, so they're going to check a blood sugar and give a correction bolus. They're also going to count their carbs, give a meal bolus. So they took insulin at 8 o'clock. That is starting the 3-hour clock. They have active insulin in their body until 11 a.m. At noon, they're hungry, they're having lunch. Great. There's no active insulin in their body. They're going to check a blood sugar, count their carbs, give a correction and meal bolus together. So from noon until 3 p.m., they have active insulin in their body. But at 2 o'clock, they were hungry. They wanted a snack. Awesome. That's fantastic. But at 2 o'clock, let's look at that upside down U. Go up from 2 o'clock and you can see that the blood sugar will likely be elevated, but there's still active insulin in the body working to bring that blood sugar down. So we're not going to worry about what our blood sugar is right now. There's already insulin handling it. So at 2 o'clock, we're just going to count our carbs and give a meal bolus. But we need to reset that 3-hour clock. So now 2 o'clock is our start time. We have active insulin until 5 p.m. Dinner's at 6. Great. All of that active insulin is out of our body. We can check a blood sugar again and give a correction if needed, along with our meal bolus. That insulin is active in our body till 9 o'clock, in which we checked another blood sugar, gave a correction if needed, and also covered a bedtime snack if we wanted to. So all in all, our 3-hour rule really pertains to correction boluses. We do not correct elevated blood sugars within the 3-hour window of our last dose. Now this again is pretty complex, and I understand if it was overwhelming, and we will cover this again, but just want to give you a little bit more flexibility in your day so that you're not so regimented to having to space out your snacks and meals quite so far apart. So if you have questions about this, please, please, please reach out. We are happy to talk you through this further. Okay, so you were discharged home using insulin pens, and those are handy dandy little tools. This lovely thing, dial up your dose. Now, you can also administer insulin with a syringe, and it's really important for all people with diabetes to know how to use a syringe to dose their insulin. So we may need to use syringes for a couple of different reasons. One might be you dropped your pen and this dosing mechanism no longer turns appropriately. If that's the case, we still have insulin inside this pen that is good. And so we can use a syringe to pull that insulin out and dose it if needed. Another really common reason to use syringes is for half-unit basal dosing. So your Lantus, that basal insulin, it only has increments in whole units on the pens. It can't deliver half units. And if you're on really minimal insulin dosing and you need 1.5 units, well, you're going to need to use a syringe to pull that out of the pen. So insulin syringes, we would have sent a prescription to your home pharmacy, so you could pick that up at any time if you want to keep a backup supply at your house. And if you're ever in a pinch, you can actually get them over the counter. They just won't run through your insurance, but you technically can if you're in a pinch. So insulin syringes, if we're dosing with a syringe, you always have to make sure it's an insulin syringe. So I'm going to hold mine up to the camera, but you can also see it on the screen there. Insulin syringes always have an orange cap, and on the side of them, they say insulin. So you probably can't see my screen from this far away, but it says insulin on the side. Always confirm it's an insulin syringe because insulin syringes deliver in 1/100th of the volume of normal syringes. So we want to make sure we're using an insulin syringe so we don't give too much insulin. All right, so if we're going to be using an insulin syringe, we are going to look at the side of the pen, or I'm sorry, of the syringe, and we're going to note that there are those numbers going down the side, which you can see in this image on the right-hand side. So on the side of your syringe, it's going to have these hash marks that are kind of bolded. Those are typically in 5-unit increments down the side of the syringe. The top bold line is 0, and then there are little hash marks that indicate individual units. So you can draw up to the individual unit. On the other side, the left-hand side of this, these markings are more small dashes. Those are your half unit increments. Okay, so there's two sides of those dashes. The right side is your whole units, left side is your half units. So on your syringe, there's a plunger that you can move up and down, and at the top is a black rubber piece. The top of the black rubber piece is what you're going to line up with your insulin dose. So that's how you're determining the dose on the syringe, is that top of the black rubber piece. Okay, now that you understand the orientation of a syringe, how do we actually give insulin with this? So first thing you want to do is you want to draw up air into your syringe to the number of units you're going to be giving. So let's say you're giving 5 units of insulin, you're going to draw up 5 units of air. You're going to inject this directly into your pen where you attach your pen needle and inject your air inside. This just offsets the pressure so that you can actually pull insulin into it. After you've put air in here, you're going to flip it upside down, think of gravity, and then you're going to draw up the amount of insulin that you need. So right now I'm drawing up 5 units. After that, your insulin is ready to go. Make sure there aren't any air bubbles. If there are, flick them out and draw up a little bit more insulin to the correct dose. And then once there are no bubbles, you are ready to administer. And you're just going to administer this very similarly to your pen. Inject at a 90-degree angle, hold it for 10 seconds before withdrawing from the skin. Insulin syringes, just like your pen needles, are one-time use only, so they do need to go into your sharps bin after using, and then you need to use a new one with every subsequent injection. So that's syringe use. It may be something that you use, it may not be, but again, really smart for you to know how to use them in case you ever do need to use them in the future. Okay, so speaking of sharps, sharps disposal. So all of our pen needles, our lancets, our syringes, they do need to be disposed of in a sharps bin. We don't want to poke anybody else. So you don't have to use an actual medical sharps container. You sure can if you want to, but most people opt to use an empty, puncture-proof plastic container. So laundry detergent is a super common thing to use. Otherwise, I like to use bleach bottles and Drano bottles because of that child-proof top. That's my own preference. But really, any puncture-proof plastic container is going to work. So you're going to put your sharps in there. Once it's full, shut it. Tape it shut if it doesn't have that child-proof top, and write sharps on the outside. From there, you can most likely put it into your dumpster, but I would confirm with your waste management company to find out if that is okay or not. You can either put it inside or on top of your dumpster, but best to confirm with them. So you can determine that by calling 1-800-CLEANUP, or you could go to your waste management company's website to determine that. Other option, like I said before, you can use an actual sharps container, which you can get at the pharmacy. But again, that's really up to your discretion if you do want to get that or not. Alrighty, that concludes video 2, Understanding Insulin. Up next is hypoglycemia. Looking forward to seeing you in video 3. Thanks so much, guys. See you in a bit.